Susan met Bill in the fall of '54, on their first day of registration in the Fine Arts Department of Columbia University. She was sitting by the registrar's desk for her individual interview, with her filled-out forms before her, trying to persuade the woman holding her transcript that her college courses were sufficient for entry to graduate school. "But, Miss Bernard, I don't see evidence of a basic survey course," the woman had said. Susan had countered by saying, "Oh, but if you look down further, you can see that I took several art history classes that, when added up, are comparable to a survey course." The woman had paused, scanned the lower part of the page more carefully, and her expression had, to Susan's eyes, become softer, less skeptical. The woman continued to peruse the document, and Susan, happening to look to the side, saw a young man standing a few paces away. He was looking at her intently. Meeting her eyes, he smiled. "My goodness," she thought, pleased but slightly rattled because his presence was distracting her. She was now quite worried that she might not be accepted into the program, and had put high hopes on securing her entry that very afternoon. The registrar stood up suddenly and excused herself, saying, "I'll need to talk with Professor Southworth about this." She walked across the room and entered a half-open doorway. Susan had felt quite confident when she had walked into the admissions office earlier. Previous phone inquiries had led her to believe that her background was suitable for consideration, but she hadn't talked to this particular woman before, and her former high spirits were diminishing like a leaking inner tube. Looking around the large room, she saw that more prospective students were waiting than before. She suddenly feared that they would be more qualified than she. The tall young man was looking at her again. She dropped her eyes and turned back towards the desk, awaiting her fate. "He's good-looking," she thought. A few minutes later, the registrar returned. "It will be all right, Miss Bernard," she said. "The chair says that your record is acceptable, but that you must be sure to take the course in early Christian art, since it's the one area you seem to be spotty in." "I've already taken care of that," she assured the woman. Thanking her, she left her forms on the desk. She sat in the back of the room, needing to compose herself after the minor ordeal she'd been through. A moment later, she sensed someone sitting down beside her. It was the tall young man who'd smiled at her before. "Did you make it?" he asked. "I did," she said. "What about you?" "Me too," he grinned. "She gave me a hard time about going to 3 different colleges, but my grades were good enough to put me over the top." "It's a relief, isn't it?" she said. "I couldn't have faced my family if I'd been turned away." She got up to go, and he stood up as if to accompany her. "Are you finished for the day?" he asked. "Yes. It's home for me by subway and bus," she added. "I live in New Jersey, and it'll take a good hour to get home." "Well, I'm walking to the subway myself," he said. "My name's Bill Prescott." She smiled up at him and said, "I'm Susan Bernard. Glad to meet you." They filed out of the room, down the long hall to the elevator, and once outdoors, walked across the brick walkways, chatting about the courses they'd signed up for. "Well, I'm here to study with Meyer Shapiro," Bill answered, when she asked him what made him choose Columbia. "I heard him lecturing at the new school a while ago. I like the way he puts art in the context of political events. He can blend history and aesthetics like nobody else. He really puts you in the picture." She was impressed by his enthusiasm. "And you," he asked, "what brings you here?" I'm planning to get the degree so I can get a job in a museum and work with groups of children, she said. He stopped, looked down at her, and smiled. That sounds interesting, he said. Susan liked the feeling of walking alongside the tall, slender young man, although she had to take 3 quick steps for each lengthy 2 that he took. He looked rather Nordic, with his large, regular features, and reminded her of the good-looking German men she'd noted when she once visited Germany. He had an easygoing manner about him, and she liked the way he'd approached her, in a gentle, not aggressive way. His approach had somehow been very natural to her. They were passing through the campus gates now and were on Broadway, which was heavy with rush hour traffic. Well, I go downtown, he said, pausing. And I go in the other direction, she said. They smiled at each other, parting company. See you around, he said. She arrived home around 5 and opened the front door of her house to find her mother waiting for her. How did it go today, dear? Her mother asked. Just fine, she assured her. I'm definitely in the program. I got all the courses I wanted. I had to do some convincing, but it all turned out okay. Good news, her mother exclaimed. Did you meet any interesting fellow students today? As a matter of fact, I did. I talked to a nice young man, she said. I ran into him during registration. His name is Bill. Bill Prescott. Her mother's expression changed, and she looked as if she were thinking hard about something. I wonder if his mother's name is Betty, she said out of the blue. What do you mean? Susan asked, startled that her mother would speculate about the name of the mother of a stranger she just met that afternoon. If her name is Betty Prescott, I think your Aunt Maureen may have known her years ago, her mother stated. She was friendly with a Betty Prescott back in the 30s. They moved in the same kind of leftist circles. Maureen spent some time with her one summer somewhere up around the Cape. There are many Prescotts in the world, Susan thought. The idea that her favorite aunt, now dead and lost to her, could have known Bill's mother seemed totally far-fetched. I'll look for him tomorrow and ask him, she decided, but thought the connection most unlikely. The following morning, she kept her eye out for him, but he was nowhere to be found. Later, on her way out for a quick lunch break, she found him, standing by the elevator. I've got less than an hour to grab lunch, she said. I thought I'd pick up a sandwich nearby. There's a half-decent chock full of nuts by the corner on Broadway, he said. The coffee's good, the sandwich is not bad. I'm going past there on my way home. I have no afternoon classes today. They took the elevator, walked out into the day's brightness, heading towards Broadway. As they reached the campus gates, she looked up at him and said, I have a question, Bill. Is your mother's first name Betty? He stopped suddenly as if bolted to the brick walkway they'd just been traversing. How do you know that? He asked incredulously. Well, I mentioned your name to my mother yesterday, she replied. She wondered whether your mother's name might be Betty. My Aunt Maureen Kiernan knew a Betty Prescott years ago, and she spent one of her summers with her somewhere up near the Cape. That's amazing, Bill said. My mother does have a house up on the Vineyard. I'll have to tell her about this. I loved my Aunt Maureen a lot, she said as they walked on. She was the maverick of the family, the one that ran free. She ditched the church, became a new dealer, and went west. I spent a lot of time with her when I was younger. And she's gone now, he asked. Yes, she's dead. But I stay in touch with her husband and my cousin, her son. She felt happy telling him about Maureen. When he saw her the next day, he told her that he'd spoken to his mother and that she remembered her aunt, that they'd worked on some projects together, but that they'd lost touch with each other over the years. Susan found Bill attractive and began to look for him every day at school. They began to sit together routinely during classes, and they met often for quick lunches. If there was time, they would stroll into bookstores on Broadway afterwards, or walk towards the park. She had noticed that Bill sometimes looked preoccupied, sad, a little down perhaps. It entered her mind that he might be getting over a love affair, or even a bad marriage. She worried that he might still be married. He didn't talk a lot about himself, but she sensed something was amiss. Maybe it's just loneliness, she told herself, but she was determined to find out. One balmy fall day, they found themselves on a bench overlooking Morningside Heights, and she decided on a way to know more. They had been chatting about some great Italian and French films they'd seen over the last few years, and there was a lull in the conversation. She decided to take the plunge. She said, "I had a dream last night, Bill. I dreamt you were married." Bill laughed instantly. "Me? Married?" He responded, seeming tickled at the very idea. She was so relieved that he didn't belong to someone, and although she didn't like to lie, this was the only way she could think of to find out if he were free or not. A few days later, on a blustery afternoon, they decided to walk downhill towards Riverside Park. The wind was blowing wildly off the river. Susan was having a terrible time pitting herself against it. She began to laugh giddily at her absurd predicament when Bill reached over and put his arms around her to steady her. The feel of his arms supporting her, almost hugging her, made her legs go weak. "I think I'm falling in love," she thought. The idea both delighted and frightened her. She felt she was spinning out of control, and she could only keep steady by attending to her daily routines, her classes, monthly papers, and the long daily commute. If only he'd ask me out for a date, she'd hoped. A few days later, he invited her to hear Friday night jazz at the Hickory House. There's a terrific jazz pianist playing there. Name's Marian McPartland. She's dynamite, he exclaimed. Susan knew a lot about classical music, but knew very little about jazz, and certainly not the cutting-edge jazz that Bill talks so much about. He told her that he'd played the trombone for 2 years, had studied with Lenny Tristano, a blind jazz pianist. He had thought that he wanted to be a jazz trombonist for a time, but had finally decided not to follow through with it. "Why didn't you?" she asked him. "My technique couldn't come close enough to what my dreams were," he explained. That Friday they'd stayed late in the library, then headed downtown to an inexpensive, fresh restaurant in the West 40s. They sat towards the back of the place at a small square table, covered by a checkered red and white tablecloth. "What would you like to drink?" he asked when the waiter approached. She paused for a second and said, "A martini." She'd never tasted one before, but loved the look of them, the chilled, up-ended pyramids poised on narrow glass stems. "And with a lemon twist," she added. "Make it 2, Bill said to the waiter. "But mine with an olive." He reached into the inner pocket of his sport coat and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. "Want one?" he asked. "No, thanks," she replied. "My parents are both smokers, and they've always begged me not to start." She laughed and felt that perhaps he would think her too much of a goody-good. Bill lit up and smiled at her as he blew smoke out of the corner of his mouth. They dined on coq au vin, sautéed potatoes, and incredibly green string beans. I've heard they add a pinch of baking soda for them to be so green, she said. My green beans never look so well. She liked the way the red wine was served in drinking glasses, the unpretentiousness of the place. Afterwards, they walked out into the cool night air filled with neon lights, strolling couples, and car-filled streets. When they entered the Hickory House, they were seated at the elliptical bar with a baby grand mounted on its center platform. The set hadn't started yet, but people were beginning to fill the room, and they were glad to be in a place with an unobstructed view of the keyboard. Soon after, a drummer ambled onto the stage, followed by the bass player. Moments later, a slender, pretty blonde wearing a long white dress walked onto the platform and, after a bow to the enthusiastic crowd, sat down at the piano. Susan was unprepared for the sounds the diminutive woman launched the moment her hand struck the keys. She was playing How High the Moon, but not in the way she had ever heard it. The magical chord changes, the driving left-hand beat, the shimmering tones from the light use of pedal, and the flying fingers which wove the melody through variations and transpositions. Susan was caught up in the rhythmic train of the music, and it had the effect that the martini had. It made her want to cut loose from her guarded, careful behavior. "You're enjoying it, aren't you?" Bill asked, looking down at her. She took a breath, saying, "You didn't exaggerate. She's wonderful." Toward the end of the second set, Bill looked at his watch. It was after 11:30, and he asked her, "Have you had enough?" She knew that he would drive her home soon, and she nodded, adding, "But I'd love to hear her again sometime." He settled the bill, and they pushed through the dense crowd and walked outdoors. Bill flagged a cab. Settling into the back seat, he gave the driver his address. "I thought you might like to drop by my place before I take you home," he said. "Sure," she said, "I'd like that." They sped down 7th Avenue, took a right turn, and pulled up beside a 4-story gray house. She stood waiting for him as he paid the fare, then walked past him as he unlocked and opened the front door for her. "I'm on the 2nd floor," he said, following her as she climbed the narrow, carpeted stairs. She stopped on the landing. He unlocked the door, pushing it open into a dark room. Stepping in first, he flicked on the light switch. It was a good-sized room with a dark wood bureau, a twin bed, and a kitchenette to the side. "Let me show you around," he offered. She followed him through a narrow bathroom that led to a small living room. It's a charming place, she thought. The walls were a slate blue-gray, setting off the polished white marble fireplace nicely. There were a couple of blonde wood upholstered chairs and a sofa mounted on a low platform with matching throw pillows. He opened a side door to a room only big enough to hold a desk and a wooden swivel chair. "So this is where you work?" she asked, peering in. "Yes," he said agreeably. "It's just enough space for me." "It's cozy here," she commented, stepping back to the living room. "Have you lived here long?" "Since I got out of college 2 years ago," he replied. "My mother owns 2 adjacent houses, and she lives in the one next door. When the former tenant moved out, I got to rent this place." She felt that she was waiting for something to happen, but she could not move nor think of anything to say. She looked over at him helplessly. He suddenly moved to her and wrapped his arms around her tightly, burrowing his face into hers and kissing her. She slid her hands up into his jacket and wrapped her arms around his back, feeling his warmth through the thin cotton shirt. "Sweet, sweet, sweet," she murmured to him, kissing him back, rubbing her cheek against his, pulling him down on her. "We're in the throes now," she thought. "It is a wonderful madness." A few months later, Bill asked her if she would consider coming to his family's home for dinner. She had been staying with him routinely on weekends, telling her family that she needed to study in the library Saturdays, that she was staying at a girlfriend's in town. They seemed to take her at her word. Her anxiety about being found out was coupled with a measure of Catholic guilt that she hadn't begun to overcome. She'd been taught that nice girls were not supposed to have sex before marriage, and that girls that did would probably be abandoned by the men they'd trusted. And Bill confessed to being uneasy about his family seeing them as they left early Mondays for the subway that would take them uptown to school. He had told her that his therapist had advised him to keep his private life just that. He mentioned that the chance of being seen was unlikely since his mother and stepfather went to their New Jersey place weekends and did not usually return till Monday around noon. But their concerns of being found out did not deter them from staying together. There was something exciting about the clandestine life they were leading, and Susan loved the coziness of their Sunday morning world, the sun slanting on the mattresses they had spread on the floor. She would wear one of his long pajama tops. They would breakfast on Thomas date nut bread with cream cheese and top it off with steaming cups of instant coffee. Afterwards, they would usually listen to their Nat King Cole rendition of Our Love is Here to Stay and head out for the park, a neighborhood stroll, or a museum uptown. The invitation to his mother's house was significant, she thought. She wanted to meet his family, finally, and she imagined that him asking her for dinner signaled a serious purpose on his part, that he wanted them to know that she was not just any girl, but someone who had become very important to him. She was terribly excited the entire day of the dinner. Bill was to meet her there. A few minutes before 7, she emerged from the Sheridan Square subway stop, walked north on 7th Avenue, and a few blocks later turned into the tree-lined street she knew so well. She walked past Bill's doorway, stopping by the staircase next to it. Taking a breath, she resolutely walked up the stairs and rapped at the front door. Seconds later, she heard the shrill sound of a dog barking and approaching footsteps. A cheerful-looking maid opened the door, and behind her Susan could see a tall woman rapidly coming down the carpeted stairs, her emerald skirt swirling around her long, slender legs. "I'm Betty," she announced, stretching out her hand to Susan. "You must be Susan. Come in." Behind her, a small terrier barked furiously, springing up and down around her ankles. "Be quiet, Surprise," she shouted. But the little dog was quite hysterical, and the maid scooped it up quickly, carrying it from the hall. Susan felt quite overwhelmed by the noise of the dog, the height of the woman, and the strong impression that she was in a particularly beautiful house. She followed Betty through a small room which contained a beautifully carved fireplace, Louis XV chairs, and a silk Chinese wall hanging of a princess with a peony in her hand. Walking up the 2 steps that led to the drawing room beyond, she wondered whether Bill had arrived yet, but she did not feel comfortable asking the tall woman who strode briskly just ahead of her. Entering the drawing room, she saw 2 courtly-looking gentlemen who rose to greet her. The first, stepping forward quickly, introduced himself as Alec, Bill's stepfather. He shook her hand, smiled cordially, and looked at her in a way that made her feel attractive, welcome. In his 70s, perhaps, he exuded energy and a robust self-confidence. He introduced her to the other guest, a silver-haired gentleman, an old friend of the family who had been active for years in liberal British politics. Settling into a dark velvet sofa, Susan had accepted a glass of wine. Small talk ensued, with Betty hoping that Susan had had no difficulty finding their place, and Susan assuring her that she had found it quite easily. She felt a trifle uncomfortable thinking of how well she knew the apartment next door, but she shrugged off the feeling, relieved at the next moment to hear the front doorbell, followed shortly by the sound of Bill's voice heading towards them. During dinner, Susan was awed by the political discussion that whirled around her. There was talk of Cold War politics, the growing problems in Indochina, and allusions to historical events from the distant past. Vivid points of view were exchanged on issues she felt quite hazy and unsure about. The atmosphere seemed charged with wit and energy, resembling a seminar more than a dinner party. She listened a great deal, said very little, and frequently looked over at Bill, who looked back with his steady, reassuring gaze. She found herself looking at Betty during the evening and wondering what made her tick. The woman was striking, with her aquiline nose, high forehead, her wavy gray hair brushed back from her temples. Betty punctuated her points a great deal with her long, slender hands. She wore no jewelry, not even a wedding band. Her features were in constant motion, animated by her well-expressed, definite opinions. Her accent was New York patrician, Susan thought. No one in her world spoke quite like that. She thought of FDR. Yes, that is how she speaks, she decided. Alec, as dynamic in his way as Betty, discoursed in stentorian tones as if he were making a speech. He had a well-developed chest which puffed out when he spoke. An aging Laurence Olivier, she thought, with a Bostonian accent. Looking around her, she was aware of the old, polished wooden tables and chairs, an old fireplace against one wall, and a hutch holding antique English plates. The silver, salt, and pepper shakers and the heavy silverware reflected the candlelight, and she noticed a garden outside the windows lit by an old-fashioned lamp post. On her way out of the house, she paused by the front door to thank Betty and Alec for the good time. "You knew my Aunt Maureen once?" she asked Betty. "Oh, yes, a fine woman," she commented. "Well, it's late, and we mustn't keep you both any longer." Susan would have liked Betty to have said more. The response was almost brusque, but she reasoned that perhaps Betty was tired after such a long evening and that they could talk about Maureen together at some future time. Driving her back that night, Bill asked what she thought of the evening, and she confessed that she had felt very inadequate to the occasion. She could not help thinking of typical dinners in her own home, where prosaic conversations were as bland as the unseasoned food her family was accustomed to. "Your parents are brilliant. They seem to be so knowledgeable," she marveled, adding, "Mine are good people, but on a much lower wavelength."